Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, still. And nice to see
May
you
I
all.
introduce you? Jane, would you like to introduce you?
You know, I'm running away with it. I'm a little hoarse.
Okay.
Okay, well, just let me
Jane.
say, I'd like to introduce you to my teacher, Grace Shireson. When I first started to see Grace, she was the abbess of the emptiness Zendo up in north of Fresno. And I went to the spot training with her during that time and learned a lot about being a priest and how to handle myself and how to do lectures and all kinds of interesting things. And it's still continuing, but now it's online.
Yes, it's
And if
online.
anyone is interested in talking to her about it afterwards, please do so. Anyway, so Grace is the mother of 2 boys and 3 grandchildren and has maintained a very strong practice for many, many years, like 50 years or more, and in Suzuki Roshi's lineage, and has a great deal to tell you, and I hope you will all have very good questions for her. This is a great chance for you to plunge the knowledge that is sitting right here of many years' practice.
And,
Thank
and
you.
Grace is also the author of Women,
Zen Women.
Zen
Zen
Women.
Women, which is the authoritative book on on women in Buddhism, I think, perhaps could you say?
Women's history.
Women's history.
And a Zen Bridge, the lectures of my teacher in Japan.
And also 3 books of women teachers, of which Grace is part of those also.
So I do hope you'll have questions and have your own opportunity to be naked in the Zendo. I did not pick the title. You know,
Oh, you didn't? I thought you had.
I know. We get along with our people who say they're going to publish us. So, you know, some things we fight back on and some we don't. So I had a couple of ideas for the title of the book. One was The Foot in the Air, which there's a chapter of that about Darlene Cohen's practice. She had terrible rheumatoid arthritis. And when it was so bad, there were times she couldn't get up the stairs to the Zen Center, just the steps outside the building. But through her practice, she learned how to keep her attention on the foot that was in the air rather than the one that was making contact with the concrete. So that was one idea. The other was the sky starts here. And
I like that one.
yeah. And nonetheless, Shambhala liked the chapter that I wrote as a title, Naked in the Zendo, which actually was a story of a man, maybe in his 60s or so, a layperson who had cooked that morning at Berkeley Zen Center. In a Berkeley Zen Center, when we had orioki breakfast, the cook would come out and bow to the congregation. And so he did, except on the 3rd bow, his pants fell off. So he was in this position in the Zendo, and there were somewhere between 50 and 100 people watching him, except most of them were obeying orders and keeping their eyes down, but many of us saw, because I was serving food, so I was standing there watching the cook's bows. So he picked them up right away. He was wearing underwear. There are some saving graces. And he then, as the laughter started, he left the Zendo. So that became the basis of my teaching. Not, good thing the ropes don't fall off. That's good. But make your mistakes often and publicly, because when you think about making a mistake, particularly in a room full of people who are paying attention, and there are rules about how to do things, your ego gets involved. And you don't want to make mistakes. You want to be good at it. And so this was one of the great teachings for me. And afterwards, I went to him and said, I felt a little bad about laughing, but it wasn't my fault. See, my ego was involved. It wasn't my fault because it was Sojun Mel Weitsman Roshi who was sitting at the front of the room, and he started laughing. I was really trying hard to keep it together. Once he started laughing, then I started laughing and had the tray of food in my hands, so I couldn't do anything to wipe away the tears or the snot that was running down my face. So there I was serving the oryoki in this situation, and people who saw me, of course, started laughing because I was such a mess. Afterwards, I went to George and said, so, how was that? And he said, well, really, I wanted to go up to Sojun and say, Master, I have been enlightened. It's true, I mean, you can't top it. And that was why it was such a teaching for me. It's like you worry about every little thing. You're going to burp or fart in the Zendo. Are you going to spill your water? Are you going to bump into people? Are you going to be able to make it through the sitting? You worry about all these little things, but you will never top George. So now you can stop worrying. And so George has since passed away, so I spoke to his widow to make sure it was okay to include his chapter in the book. So that was a chapter that Shambhala liked, and of course with this cover. Now I had some beautiful aesthetic covers in mind, Japanese and art. Nope. So both my husband and my younger son are in marketing, so I said, what do you think? And they said, no, that's a winner. That will sell books. Okay. So you give up on certain things when you're publishing a book. I do want to, while I still remember, go back to what Jane said about Shogaku Institute, which we had trainings when I had a physical location, which became very hard to sustain because of the fires all around. And I wasn't there all the time, and I had, like here, we had a lot of art. So I ended up actually selling the retreat center to a Tibetan group who came and said, we can have a retreat tomorrow here, great. So they're still there offering retreats. But since I don't have a physical location, I've recruited a number of teachers, and we're offering classes online, and even offering a Master's of Divinity, an MDiv, should you wish to be a chaplain. The classes are in how to give a dharma talk, how to talk to people about their problems, actually taught by a person who taught master's level counseling for people who are preparing for a licensing exam, who's also a Zen priest. He's also teaching a class on healthy dynamics in the Sangha. We have classes on cross-cultural, healthy boundaries, and so on. So these are all ways that our priests need to be educated. Learning how to bow and attend to the altar are very wonderful things, and how to ring the bells, but also we need to learn how to be together in a wholesome way. So anyway, the place is called Shogaku Zen Institute, and it's shogakuzen.org. And anyway, you can talk to me about it afterwards, but I did want to put that plug in. That's part of what I do right now, is talk to the instructors and recruit students, and we try to stay small so that I know everybody who's signed up, and that's how we're operating right now. We have had good fortune with the Association of Professional Chaplains, who haven't officially approved us as an institution, but when they saw our students, we've graduated 3 students. The first 2 that went through that, when they submitted their paperwork, they looked at all the work they'd done, and they said, okay, they get the MDiv equivalent, we approve it. So that was a good thing. It saved the students a lot of work. So I do that, and actually have 4 grandchildren now. In my book, Zen Women, I only had 3. So I had to mention in this book that I have a 4th one now who didn't make it into that book. She wasn't born until 2010. That is Gala Amador Shirson, who is 9, who will definitely not be left out. So I have to make sure I include her. She lives in New York, and I spend a lot of time in New York, so I can be with her because I still get cuddles. And my other ones are all older, and That doesn't work. But today I wanted to talk about the match we're trying to make with our current environment, our life in this world, in this political world, in this svaha world of suffering. How do we match that with our practice? And I was really struck in a talk or an article, I think that Marie Yovanovitch, who had been the ambassador to the Ukraine, she wrote an article for the New York Times some time ago, maybe a week or so ago. And she said, we will endure, we will persist, and we will prevail. It just gives me chills to say it, actually. And when I read it, I thought a lot about how it sounded like such a female way of talking about power. Because we don't go up and punch somebody and knock them down. And even as Zen masters, we don't get up there on the mountain and say, I am, the king of Zen and nobody can match me. We're always working together with people. And actually the feminine strength, as I see it, is endurance. It's endurance. So there was both my recognition of the truth of her words and also how do we live with those words without, as I taught my students, I am not teaching you to become a doormat. That's not the point of Buddhism. Just accept, and don't do anything else. I'm not teaching you to be a doormat. So those words of enduring and persisting and in that way prevailing, what does that mean for us in our practice today? And so I thought I would share something. There were 2 chapters that come to mind in the book. And the book is organized more or less chronologically, but also by levels of working with your awareness. So first we discover there is awareness. It isn't exactly ours. It's inside us, it's outside us. We share it with others because when you come to the Zendo and sit, it's different than when you're sitting by yourself. And it's not because you're talking to anyone, it's because of that energy that's generated. So there's awareness, and that awareness is amplified in some ways by practice, by attention. And at some point, we also learn to bring that awareness to the rituals, to the oryoki practice, to kinhin practice, where we space ourselves according to how others are moving. We're using our awareness in a group setting. And finally, in our lives, in the last section of the book, I write about my experiences as a mother, some of them failures, particularly in the driving department. I remember my younger son and I had gotten tickets, so we went to traffic school together. And we all went around to say what we had done to end up there. Now, I had been going too fast, and when it came to his turn, he said, I'm here because of her. That's my mom. And my older son, most famously, his quote was, once when I was in the car with him and I was swearing at the driver in front of me, of course. It wasn't my fault. So I said something and he repeated it. And I said, it would be better if you didn't use the same swear words that I do. And he said, Mom, there are none left. So I'll do what I can when I give this talk. But anyway, I have, when I talk about parenting, it's not that we master that. We do prevail if we live through it and they live through it, God bless. But we have, at that point, not a way to sit down and ask our sons to do zazen with us and to work it out through that. We have to deal with it as it arises. So I wanted to talk about 2 experiences of working with the essential koan. The essential koan, according to Hisamatsu from Japan, was when nothing will do, what will you do? which is kind of where we are now. It doesn't matter what we do, we still keep being presented with very uncomfortable situations, at least in our political life and probably in all aspects. So when nothing will do, what will you do? And so this is how it is. We don't just become victimized by our suffering, by our enduring, by our persisting, but how do we prevail, even though it may not call for a violent or conflictual response? So I'll read from a chapter, and I have 2 chapters actually, so I may skip a bit. This is called Torn Panties on the Electric Meter. Now, actually, here's where I did fight with my publisher because I interrupted a rape scene, and I saw the panties on the electric meter, and I wanted to give a vivid description of that, and they were like, this is, I'm thinking that this is like a trigger warning thing, there's a lot of fun and funniness in the book, and here I'm talking about panties on the electric meter. So they said, no, we want that chapter to be called Every Decision Matters. So then I changed it to, I said, let me give them a warning that there's some violence involved. Torn panties on the electric meter, how's that? So they realized I wasn't going to budge on that particular thing, even though they do have the final say. So besides doing Zen meditation in Berkeley, this was in the 60s, I was living a social experiment, riding a motorcycle, living on my own, and trying to be true to my ideals. As a result of my Zen training, I was beginning to consider the weight and import of each moment. I was faced with decisions about war, poverty, and racism. Through practicing Zen, I could see that my life was formed by my presence in each moment. I wondered about which efforts mattered. How would I know what mattered? In my last year at UC Berkeley, which was 1967 to 68, I was 21 and living in what was known to be a dangerous part of town with the presence of drug dealers and gangs. I lived with another woman in a 2-bedroom apartment with a yellow-painted kitchen floor. As UC Berkeley students, I felt that we both stood out. Well, I couldn't say, this is another change from the publisher, that we were the only white ones in the neighborhood. So there was that. That was during redlining, where people of African American descent had to live in certain parts of town and were not allowed to rent or buy elsewhere, whether it was formal or informal. So, cognizant of our surroundings, we were both careful about our comings and goings. And I didn't go out in the neighborhood after dark, but I did go to the Berkeley Zen Center on my motorcycle for meditation every morning. Daily group meditation and silent breakfast were affecting me. As I followed my breath, I was becoming aware of the meaning in each breath and in each moment, and the choice I had to be fully present in each moment. I was particularly affected by Suzuki Roshi's question. If the Buddha didn't exist, what are you doing sitting here today? This answer to my question came about because one day Suzuki Roshi came to Berkeley Zen Center. I think he came a few times while I was sitting there. And he gave a talk, and I thought to myself, who does this guy think he is, interrupting my zazen? Because the talk wasn't even that good. It was all about, so it must have been March or possibly April, because all he was talking about in very broken English was, some people think the Buddha's birthday is March, some people think it's April, some people think it's this, some people think it's that. That was the whole talk. So I'm getting madder and madder, which is my favorite thing to do. That's why I'm not a natural for this practice at all. So when the time came for questions, Miss Berkeley Coed had her hand up. Who cares when the Buddha's birthday is? And the rest of the room is like hiding under their zafus. Really, there's no place to hide when someone's that embarrassing and rude to this revered teacher. And he said, Well, if the Buddha was a human being, and we believe he was born. And if he was born, he had a birthday. And if he had a birthday, we should be able to know when it is. And if we don't, what are you doing sitting here today? I was knocked over. First of all, he hadn't folded or crumbled as some of my professors had with my nasty mouth. And second of all, it really penetrated that there I was connected to the Buddha in this moment. So life is a series of momentary actions that bring us to our present circumstances and form the quality of our lives. So we could say that the quality of our minds, the quality of our consciousness, helps to determine the quality of our lives. One morning after meditation at the Zen Center, a woman, and I remembered her name, Cam. I don't know if you know her. No, okay. A woman described being raped in her apartment. Like me, she was not living in the best part of town. She shared that her concern during the rape was how to remain calm while it happened. She used considerable effort to not scream. I puzzled over what seemed to me to be her Zen approach to rape. Should she have fought back or screamed? I didn't know the context of the situation, or that I would soon find myself in such a moment. One night soon after, I was awakened by screams. It was a female voice, and the screams were chilling and terrifying. I looked at the clock. It was 12:20 a.m. Not so late. I listened for other sounds. After all, I wasn't the only one living there. There were many apartments around. Doors opening or closing, footsteps or shouting back. I was listening for the sounds of her rescue. Wouldn't someone else come for her screams? But I heard nothing. My mind expanded in that moment, and I thought, this is my moment. This is the meaning of Zen. How do we connect to a moment and realize our true nature right now? I wanted to stay in bed, but the urgency, the screams, and the fact of Zen wouldn't let me. I struggled for a moment with the realization and my doubts. Was there really such a thing as facing truth, as meeting this moment? My connection to Zen and the expansion of my mind in the crisis demanded that I had to know. I got up. I turned on my bedroom light. She was still screaming. I threw on a dress over my bedclothes and put on shoes, and she was still screaming. I went to my kitchen, turned on a light, and took a small serrated knife from the drawer. As I gripped the wooden handle tightly in my hand, she was still screaming. It was not over yet. I went down the stairs and out the front door. I followed the screams to the back alley behind my building. As I approached, I heard the sound of running feet, but she was still screaming. When I saw her on the ground, she was still screaming. Her wild screams scared me, and she was curled up like a frightened animal. She screamed when I reached out to touch her, to pat her back and tell her it was just me. She kept screaming, "It's just me, they're gone, you're safe." She was still screaming. I needed to repeat this message several times before she was able to look up and see me there. As she stood and moved away from the wall, I saw her panties on the electric meter, flowered cotton and lace, hanging on the metal and glass dial of the meter. I left them there. I didn't know if the men or boys would come back. I didn't know how much time we had. I put my arm over her back and led her around the corner of the building to my apartment. The door was still open. The light was still on. I locked the door behind us and we went upstairs to the kitchen with the yellow floor. In that moment, I loved that yellow floor for its cheeriness and innocence. She was still shaking, but she had stopped screaming. I dropped the small knife into the sink. I only had powdered milk, and I used it to make her warm milk, to which I added honey. I hoped it was soothing. She began to speak. She said there were 3 young men. She thought they were friendly. She cried about the lost underwear they had torn from her body. She cried about the humiliation, but she said they had not yet hurt her. They had run away. When she was a little calmer, we called her mother. Her mother was worried. Her daughter was late coming home. She told her mother she was safe. I spoke to her mother and got the home address. I called a cab. When the cab came, I asked the driver to come up. I told him the address and asked him how much it would cost. He accepted the $12, that was all I had, that I gave him, and he blessed me. She hugged me, and she went home to her mother. My roommate had awakened by then, but she had not heard the screams. She heard us talking in the kitchen. The screams awakened me, and I was present in the moment. I tried hard to matter, even when I was scared, and even if I could fail. An emergency can expand your consciousness. I also learned that night about faith. If you trust faith, your practice will deepen, and your faith in your practice will increase. Every moment matters, and it is moment by moment that we reveal our faith. There's a folk tale about 2 frogs that fell into a pail that was filled halfway with fresh milk. The level of milk was too low for them to reach the top of the pail. The sides of the pail were high, steep, and slippery, and they could not climb out no matter how hard they struggled. The frogs kicked, and they swam in circles until they both became tired. The smart frog appraised their situation more quickly, and he said, "We're done for. There's no way to get out of this bucket. I am tired, and I give up." The smart frog soon drowned and died in the bucket, but the other frog was not smart enough to realize he could not get out of the situation. So he tried anyway. He kicked, and he kicked, and he kicked, and he kicked because he couldn't figure out what else to do. Then something strange happened. The milk began to turn thicker around him. This made kicking even harder, and he was tired. It was harder to swim and to kick, but still the frog tried anyway. Finally, the milk turned thick enough that the frog could stand on top of it instead of sinking in. The milk had been turned into butter through all the frog's kicking, swimming, and churning. Standing on top of the butter, he jumped out. So I'm not suggesting, especially at my age, that I would respond the same way. Someone asked me when I talked about this chapter, "Well, didn't you have 911?" And I couldn't remember why I hadn't called 911 until a few days later. And I remembered when I was 17, before I went to UC Berkeley, and I was walking home from work, and a man started following me. And I had my shoes in my hands, so I figured, well, I'm just going to whack him with my shoes. Then I heard the sound of metal on metal, and I said, "Oh, well, you're dead." So as he approached me, I started talking. I haven't probably never spoken that fast. And then there was an alleyway between me and the next apartment building. And he started to push me towards it. And I said, "This is my apartment right here. Bye-bye, nice meeting you." And I took off, and I went into that apartment. Actually, the front door was just like the entryway, and I knocked at the first apartment I came to and called 911. The police passed him on the way to come interview me. I told them where he was. They didn't pick him up. They came to interview me. A 17-year-old girl who was just starting college. And they said, "Why aren't you crying? What's the matter with you?" He was lucky to get away from you. And that's why I didn't call 911. She didn't need to have that kind of abuse. And I had no faith in the system. That's why I didn't call. So that's one version of what to do when nothing will do. And I wanted to talk about another version. Yes?
In that chapter, you said trust and faith. In what's faith in what?
Faith is kind of little, so you might not know it yet. So for me, faith is knowing when I know, and I have a lot of faith in consciousness, awareness, and this practice of compassion for others in the moment. So where I really learned about faith, I was too young to know this was about faith when this happened. But I went to Japan to practice. And at that time, and probably still now, because of the digestive problems I have, I can't eat rice, I can't eat soy, I can't eat noodles, I can't eat potatoes. This is the diet. I think I was a bad monk in a previous lifetime. I got kicked out of the monastery for probably trying to sneak some shrimp or something. So I can't eat anything that was served in the monastery, but still I went to practice in a Japanese monastery, and I tried to fake it, but then I fainted, and the story of my fainting there was in the Zendo. It was a dramatic international moment. But I had to tell the teacher that I couldn't eat noodles, I couldn't eat soy, I couldn't eat rice, and I couldn't eat potatoes, couldn't eat miso. He went, "Oh, you can't eat with us. Find a way to eat and practice, come here and sit with us when you can." And that is when I learned about faith, because I had to trust, traveling the 5,000 miles to Japan, that I was going to find a way to eat and not die when I was there. So what I did in terms of following my faith was not say, well, I guess I have to go home, or I guess I only get to sit, 1 hour a week after I've cooked for myself over here. I walked around the neighborhood where the temple was and said, is there an inn, a family-style inn in this neighborhood? And they sent me to Takeya Ryokan. And the woman who ran Takeya Ryokan, I explained my problem. And she said, well, how are you going to cook for your retreats, for your sesshin, since you're there from 3 in the morning till 11 at night? I said, well, I'll buy the food, I'll cook it, I'll freeze it. And she said, no, you need fresh food, fresh energy when you're sitting at sesshin. She was belonged to the Tofukuji temple as a lay person. She said, I will shop and cook for you. I didn't know that was going to happen, but I wanted to practice. And so I put my faith in the 5,000 miles and in going there and continuing the effort that I would find a way. And when we do that, I'm not saying you should go out when you hear screaming or gunshots, but when we say, I don't know if this is going to work, but I really want to practice, I'm going to put my faith to this, something happens. And that's what I found. Does that explain?
Couldn't you just say that's just having trust in yourself?
No, I had no trust in myself. I was terrified that my digestive problems would get worse. I had no trust. I had to trust the universe around me. And I had to trust that my intention to practice mattered in some way that I didn't yet understand, and that either I was going to find a way or another teacher or something. But it was about putting my faith in practice as an essential thing to my life, and that because I believed in it to such an extent, because I valued it to such an extent, I would be like that frog. I would keep churning until I found it. So no, it wasn't about me. I had no faith in me. Does somebody else have a question about this?
It sounds like you had faith in the yearning within yourself, and so much so that it's what compelled you to move forward regardless.
Well, it's not just what was inside me, but that's true. I trusted my intention to practice. It was not about, I want to be a Zen teacher, and I want to be famous, and I want to have lots of followers. I want to practice. I want to get to the bottom of this. And so I'm going to go to Japan and put myself at risk because I can't eat the food, and I don't speak the language that well, and I don't know my way around. But I think it's going to take me to a very deep place. So there were two things I had faith in. Yes, that my intention to practice was not some fluff or ego-driven, but also that the practice itself would sustain me. So that there were two parts. So you will have those questions come up, which you will need to answer at times with your faith. I don't know, about these rakusus, sewing a rakusu. I mean, what's the point of all these stitches? And it's just stuff from medieval Japan. All right, I'll do it. And your mind gets blown when you do it because you have enough faith to say, okay, look, the teachers are saying this is something of value. I can't see it yet, but I trust the practice, so I'm going to try it. And that's kind of been my way, hard-headed and so on. And I've actually used it in many situations. When I was at Tassajara, I was on the serving crew, and it was the winter practice period, so it was cold. And the servers would take their socks off outside of the Zendo before they brought the food in. And I'm thinking, frostbite anybody? But I said, hey, if this is all that's standing between me and supreme enlightenment, I'm taking the socks off. So I took the socks off. My feet got really cold. I served the food without socks, and I said, I'm no more enlightened than I was before. I'm leaving the socks on. So when you have faith in the examination itself and putting one foot in front of the other, you find out, okay, this is the way. I trust my discernment to a certain extent, not completely, to a certain extent, and I discerned that, no, this was, I think, a macho thing. I think it was one of those macho things that happens in monasteries. I'm tougher than you, and I can take my socks off and have blue toes, and I still prevail. No, and it didn't do it for me. So, but I was willing to try. Is there another question about this, about faith? So, the other chapter.
Over here.
Yes.
I just am curious, is it possible that taking the socks off outside the Zendo was powerful and meaningful for some, not others?
I'm sure that's true, but you have to decide about your own practice. You right? Yeah. So I can't know what effect it's having on others. From what I saw, I didn't see people becoming more enlightened because they had their socks off. I didn't experience them as being more compassionate because they had their socks off. So I had to try it for myself. So that's you can only know for yourself. Yes.
Isn't it possible enlightenment knocked their socks off?
Well, if it did, it entered their fingers and they pulled the socks off. It's entirely possible. But, there's a story of Maureen O'Halloran, I think it was. I remember that book of the young woman who went to Japan, and she did takahatsu in the snow and got frostbite and everything else. And so that was what made me try it.
But I find myself, as I go through challenges with life and Zen and stuff, that I don't expect anything out of it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I don't know if that's faith or just apathy, but it's one of the things that I go through as life evolves, and you deal with all the problems that you have to deal with, like what you were saying with the rapist and stuff. And I find that I just, like, sometimes I don't feel like sitting, meditating and stuff, and I go ahead and do it. I sit there and study, and I'm going, this is making no sense, the words are bouncing off my eyes, I can't figure this out. But I keep reading. I don't know if that's faith or just plain stubbornness.
Well, I think you need some of both, certainly, to persist. There's an expression that one of my Japanese mentors taught me, which is you can't see the practice. It's like the wind. You can see where it's been. So while it's happening, you might not be able to see it, but then you can look over and see that something's moved. Someplace where you were previously reactive. And that only happens, it's like the kin hen, putting one foot in front of the other. It's like, how stupid is this? We're walking in a circle. But we do it. And we keep doing it as a way of letting go of the ego, the stubbornness, and everything else, and saying, I'm in, I need to try this. I took my husband to see a homeopath because he was having some symptoms that all the specialists in New York couldn't fix. And the homeopath gave him some medicine. And for a while he took the medicine, and they said, rats, this isn't going to work. He had no faith in it. So then he had another episode of dizziness, which, as I say, he'd been to every specialist, eyes, ears, brain, MRIs, you name it. And I said, what have you got to lose? You're kind of in this situation where you fall off the cliff into this dizziness, and you can't do anything once it happens. What do you have to lose by trying this man's medicine? And so that's kind of where we are. We know about our own suffering and our own misery, and about the world's suffering and misery. What do we have to lose? We've tried, most of us have tried everything else. And in fact, if you can try something else and it works better than this, let me know. There was a woman who gave a great talk at Berkeley Zen Center, and she said, I was feeling depressed, I was having trouble with work, and so my friend said, well, you need to go have a facial at, I guess it was Eve something, one of these famous spa places. So she went, she came back, it felt good, for a little while. She felt the same depression and meaninglessness. So her friend said, well, the problem is you didn't have the works. You need the massage, you need the facial, you need the pedicure, you need the hot tub, the isolation tank, you need the works. So sign up for the works. So she signed up for the works, and she did the works, and she felt a little better afterwards, but the same feelings came back. So the people who are sitting here, the works didn't work. The new cars, the great job, the great relationship, all the stuff, it didn't work. So now you're trying this. Good luck. And if you find something better, be sure you tell me, because I haven't. That's why I'm still here. So we can try the works. Anything else? So I just wanted to give you another example of faith and what do you do when nothing will do. At an older age, when I wasn't willing to jump out there with a serrated knife against a gang. So this happened when I was in Japan, and I was in the Zendo at about 3 or 4 in the morning, chanting and doing service, and there was another young woman from Berkeley who was with me, and I was kind of her protector and chaperone there. So I saw this thing, it was about this size, crawling on the tatami. Now, I'm not a big fan of bugs. Jane knows that. And I saw it crawling there, and I thought, it's not a cat. It's almost the size of a cat. But then it sprouted wings. And I said, oh, shit. But then it started flying right for me and her. And the monks were going about there chanting. For all I know, it's one of their pet beetles. I don't know. Guys are like that. They can have interesting pets. So when it came at me, here was the situation again. when nothing will do, what will you do? And I had to feel my feet on the tatami. I didn't have much time. That thing was buzzing and coming at me, Godzilla beetle. And I grabbed my zagu off my wrist and I opened it like this. And the bug flew right into it and sort of bounced off because, you know, bugs aren't crazy about flying into enclosed spaces. And it left. And believe me, I had no way of planning. But there are many ways to respond to situations. Calling 911 is also a possibility. And I'm not sure if they would have come for the bug. The monks, I'm not sure what they thought was going on. The monks were still chanting and looking at us, the only two women there. And they were kind of, and I wondered, are they impressed with my matador skills, or what are they, you know, or did they just think I should step aside from this bug and let it fly through? I never knew, and I never asked. There's some mysterious things that happen when you're in Japan, and I talk about those, like the time I fainted when I was sitting on the ton. So I guess what I have to say is that we will endure, we will persist, we will prevail. Doesn't look the same for each person, for any person, in any given moment. But what is the universal thread running through that is how do we recognize the reality of the situation we're in and bring our full self forward, which certainly Marie Ivanovich did, against something not as nice as that beetle. She brought her full self forward, knowing she would probably lose her job, or she had already lost her job, but she did then retire from the State Department. She didn't know that a week or two later she would go give a talk at George Washington, and have a standing ovation that was so long it was almost embarrassing for her that it just went on so long. She didn't know that when she took her stand. So the prevailing in awareness and the appropriate response is something that we learn from our practice and something that I've written about in the book. So now if you have some other questions, I'll be done for a little while.
I have one more. When you said earlier to make mistakes in the Zendo, isn't that also coming from a place of ego?
It certainly could be if you think you're going to be the worst at this. And I say that to people sometimes when they say, I'm really terrible at this. I say, don't brag. So it depends. The willingness to be seen as you are is more to the point. So that we can't help but make mistakes. We're humans, right? That's what we do. So you can make mistakes and be egotistical about it. I could purposely knock down the camera and say, aren't I enlightened? It depends on your intention. So being seen and practicing sincerely is the deal. And you can make up a lot of stories. Oh, now I'm practicing sincerely. Actually, I'm practicing so sincerely and more humbly than anyone else in here. And we do that. Our ego has ways of slipping in those tricks. And so that's just a way of asking you to look at them. And make your mistakes often and publicly is a way of saying, what is your reluctance to make a mistake? Your reluctance to make a mistake is that you don't want to be seen as a fool. Well, you know you're a fool. That's why you want to cover it up. Yes, June.
So you are also a therapist? Are you still practicing?
As a psychologist, I still have a license. I don't practice in that way.
But when you were practicing, how compatible was that practice with Buddhism?
So I saw people who didn't practice Zen or Buddhism, but I think they benefited a great deal more after I did my work of sesshin. I was just clearer about the level of where the problem was for them. And I could see through things in ways that I couldn't before. So it helped me. And so I think that it, in that way, helped other people.
Did you, when you were practicing, did you speak about Buddhism, or was it just your own private sort of lens?
I didn't want to assert any religious model or practice model, so it was just for me unless people asked me. And in Buddhism we say they have to ask 3 times before we help them out in that way. Somebody else had a question back there, you did?
Why are you here?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that question, actually. Because I thought you might be able to see something about how my life affected me and how it could help you.
And do you feel you have any obligation to the practice?
Yes, I
And
do.
what is your understanding of that?
My understanding is that the teachers who have shaped me, and it wasn't easy, gave their lives for this practice. And so did the women that I wrote about, gave their lives for this practice. And so I can't let it die. So there's a vow that you say during Dharma transmission. I will not let this practice die during my lifetime. It's kind of like the story of that little sparrow, you know, who was flying over a fire. And he kept getting a mouthful of water to put on the fire. He didn't put the fire out, in fact, he was extinguished. But that's our effort, you know, adding our droplets to this Dharma stream. Your question, my answer, those are droplets.
I have a sort of ongoing internal dialogue about the nature of desire, and I'm curious about. So I come from a more sort of bhakti tradition, and with some sort of esoteric tantra, where desire really drives us, and desire is sacred and divine. And I in this Zen path, I often sort of have a little bit of a reckoning. I notice that your vows, you use the word delusion, and which suits me much better. So I'm curious your take on the nature of desire and what that is, that longing and drive and craving.
Yeah, so how my teacher in Japan, Fukushima Roshi, used to say there are healthy desires. Relationships represent a healthy desire. You know, trying to be better in relationship to everyone else being worse, not such a healthy desire. So I think the words, I'm not saying the practices are the same, but actually there's a lot of passion in Zen. And I think, you know, when we visualize the monastic master up there on the mountain who's given it all up, we're missing something about our lives today, which is we need to care deeply about other people and manifest that. And that's part of Zen. This is not, I remember there's a chapter in the book called What's Love Got to Do with It? Because we don't often use that word in Zen. But somebody once asked Sojun Roshi, about love and Zen, and he said, I thought that was the whole thing. I thought all of Zen was about love. So, but sometimes, coming from a samurai tradition, Zen filtered through a samurai tradition, there can be a kind of spiritless almost, bland, I don't have any feelings. And sometimes you see this has been adopted at Zen centers, like I'm walking, I don't have any feelings. So we have to be careful to not imitate, but to actually inhabit our practice as ourselves and let it circulate in a way that we become ourselves on steroids.
I would hope that you, thank you very much, Grace. Thank you very much. And I hope that people will show their appreciation and gratitude by buying books.
Passionately. You need one more. You need one more possession. I know we said not so many possessions, but one more.
Yeah, and then she will, of course, sign it for you, and with enlightenment in every stroke. And
I
you'll
was
never
told
lose.
it's okay to buy, just don't become attached.
Right, right. So you can then sell it back through Amazon or somebody else, right? Pass it on.
So we have two books for that. We have the Zen Women one, which is as I said before, is seminal work, and we also have her newest one here too. And she's selling them below the mark price, $15 each.
And I would recommend you look at the Zen Women, because that's all about, Grace did a lot of study about who were the women in the background. We only hear about the men ancestors, and so she went back and studied who were the actual women ancestors that we have in the line that was still working, and not just the women who were off to the side, but actually studied as priests with as disciples. So that's really interesting if you would like to know more about the history of women in this in this practice.
And Norman Fisher had something interesting to say about that, which is actually the way women practice with families, and sometimes in convents that were made up of families, is more like the way we're practicing today. So there's a lot to be seen about how practice and family life and relationships and work life and practice are integrated by studying the female ancestors who didn't have the same kind of financial support that the men had, so they couldn't go off on the mountain. They had small temples and they offered schools. They washed people with Hansen's disease, otherwise known as leprosy. They had barbershops, they had hospitals. They did many, many community activities. So we did not invent engaged Buddhism. You will see a lot of it among the women ancestors.
And didn't Dogen have a very famous woman disciple
Yeah, he
at the
did.
time?
He had women
and sort
disciples.
Of got lost.
Yeah, it did. I meant to bring down, do you have the women's ancestor rice paper?
I do, but I don't
Yeah,
know
you
if I
know where
can
it
find
is.
it all.
Yeah,
in.
well, you have it. That's the main
I
thing. I
have
meant
it,
to bring
yeah.
some down because,
Anyway,
yeah, we spent some time at SCBA approving or allowing, because there was a lot of opposition to calling it a lineage, but we were able to call it a women ancestor document because they weren't part of the lineage that had been handed to us by our teacher. So anyway, some women, actually the woman from Clouds and Water, Judith Regier, printed them up beautifully on rice paper in a circle in a design that Salt Spring Island came up with. So they're very attractive. You were going to say something else.
so yes, I was going to say that we're going to do service now. But after that, you'll have another chance, if you would like to stay on and chat with Grace some. That's also very possible. We do have cookies and tea. And so please do that.
And just for the record, Grace's Buddhist name is Myoan, which is wondrous peace.
Yeah, something like that.
Or Wondrous Grace.
Amazing,
Amazing Grace.
Grace. So there's a reason why I took the name Grace. It's not my family name. My family name is Jill, and I think it came from my father being in England during World War II. They called girls Jill.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I was the second daughter, so it was like kind of a disappointment. I got a Jill. So I always was, in a Jewish family, they tell you who you were named for, but they couldn't remember. So when my teacher gave me the name Myoan, Amazing Grace, I said, well, I could be Grace. I don't think I'll take Amazing. That's my name. But it's nice because Jane and I have that relationship of that same character, Myokaku, in her name that she got from
And
Suzuki
also,
Roshi.
Empty Nest Zendo, which was where I first started studying with Grace, was we have the same nest character in our name also. So
Yeah.
my first name was Sojun, which was a nest cloud,
Yeah.
and so it was strange
Empty
to be
Nest
going-
was Kuso.
Yeah, and it was so strange to be going up to a place called Empty Nest that my name was like
Yeah.
part
of the characters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that we felt there was all kinds of
All,
things.
all kinds of entanglements, which we've discovered more as we talk.
As we go, yeah.
Okay.
Could I just say one more thing before we stop?
It's your temple.
No, it's a very short thing. When you were talking about endurance, I was thinking today that one of the symbols to me that fits this group more than anything, or any group, any Buddhist group, is grass. Young
Grass.
grass, because you can't stop grass from growing anywhere. Even with concrete, they'll
Pushes
find the smallest crack and come up. And I feel like that's what our practice is like. It will never be stopped because it's always finding ways to express, one way or another. Whatever
Right.
it is, it will come up through the concrete even.
Yeah, and if not now, the next lifetime.
Whenever.
If you quit now, you'll see.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
Thank you.